We also want to consider properties of bloodstains. So in this now we're going to focus more on bloodstains found at crime scenes and how they can be used to reconstruct the crime scene. And so that means we need to know something about these bloodstains. We have a couple of features that we're going to be talking about. The shape of and any distortion pattern that's seen in the bloodstain. That's going to tell us things about where the blood came from, the origin source. It can sometimes tell us a little bit about the speed at which the blood was traveling, which can sometimes tell us about the impact force. The location, where as a pattern, I would say, not the location of one specifically, but we see a location of many, can be able to help us locate the origin of the blood source. Sometimes it can also tell us about whether there was just an individual impact with, individual injury, or whether there were multiple injuries. Is this multiple stabbings or multiple blunt force object hits, or is it just one? The size of the stain is going to tell us things about how fast it was moving. And that velocity can sometimes tell us about the nature of the crime. And then there's some specific patterns that can tell us specific ideas about the actual injury that occurred. And we'll get into those. So like a blunt force hit usually has blunt force impact has a specific kind. Arterial injury has a specific kind, and we'll go into those. So we're going to take these one at a time. We're going to start with the shape. When we look at the shape, generally, if it's, most drops are going to be round. That's what drops do. So if it is round, and completely round, like a circle round, that means that it generally fell vertically. There was no sideways component to its motion. And if it's got spiked edges as opposed to a nice perfectly round circle, but it's got the spiked edges as you see on this picture over here, that's indicating that either it was at a higher speed and it hit the ground really hard, so it was coming at the ground at a higher speed, or if it's a very porous surface, not like a smooth surface like marble, but rather a very rough surface that can absorb it, maybe a carpet, maybe concrete, because it kind of has if it's not smooth concrete, that can tell us something about the surface type. When there's a sideways component to the motion, instead of falling vertically down, it's going off to the side. What we see is that when the blood hits the surface, it's got some impact to it and some impulse, and it keeps moving and it drags along. And so instead of getting a round circle, we start to get an oval. That elongation pattern can tell us things about the impact angle, exactly what direction was it coming from, and that's particularly important. And then we have, if you see a trail, right? So in general, if it's not round or elongated, but rather a sort of a line that looks like that's telling us that the source was moved, it was drugged through. So that can tell us things about, again, we're trying to reconstruct the crime scene. So then we move on to, let's talk specifically about this elongation. So one of the tasks I'm going to ask you to do, and don't worry, we'll do it together in class, it's a little bit tricky on the math, is that the direction, if it hits and it has like a little tail, note here, this is what we mean by the tail. It's kind of like a little extra part to it. That happens when it's bloodstain is hitting the surface at an angle and it kind of keeps going. The tail is the little bit that went the farthest. So the tail is telling me which direction it was coming from. So you want to kind of point to the tail, and that's the direction the blood was traveling. Some people think like it's pointing back towards the source. In fact, it's pointing away from the source. And that can help us if I now have several of these. I now know the direction that the blood was moving when it hit, and if I have several of these, I can get what we call an area of convergence. I can feed it back to say, oh, I know where the blood came from. We also will see, sometimes we get impact spatters, like, again, when it hits when something hits a pool of blood, then it makes that blood splash, right? So that's called impact splatter. And then we have sometimes satellite spatter. So these again are all these different kinds of shapes, and some of these are specific patterns we may see. The satellite spatter is if I see around the original circle or oval, whatever it is, I see extra smaller drops. Those are satellite drops. So we might say that this one is a satellite drop of this drop, this is a satellite drop of this drop, and these are satellite drops of this center drop. That's telling me that it kind of like splashed and splashed again, kind of like when you're skipping rocks, right? So it's like a double hit. So if we see that the blood, we see a nice pattern, and then we see the satellite spatter, it sort of indicates it was moving more quickly. So when it hit the surface, it had enough velocity to it that it kind of bounced and spattered again. It can be, professionals can tell the difference between satellite spatter and impact spatter. And again, this is kind of pointing out some things. We're going to talk more about these cast-off sprays when we're talking about the telltale patterns. So I'll come back to that. So now I have the overall location, and this is location not of one, but the location of the collection. I can see a couple of patterns. One is I may see a void pattern. It's really easy in this picture to see what we mean. There's sort of like an area where there is no blood. Often a void pattern, sometimes it's called a shadow or a ghost, is that there was something there, the blood hit it first and stuck to it, and then continued going past on the outside areas. And then when that object moved, I can say that there was an object here. And depending on the shape of it, sometimes I can figure out what object had been in its place prior to this. So again, we're going to recreate that crime scene. What was there when the crime happened? Also, again, this pattern of how many there are. If I can tell the direction each one was going, sometimes I can go back and say, oh, these all came from one single point. Or I had 3 different points that were bleeding that creates 3 different sets of sprays. We'll talk about that a little more in origin, site of origin. So there are also 2 vocabulary words to know about spatter, and that's forward spatter and backward spatter. Forward spatter is spatter that is traveling away from the source, and back spatter is blood that is going back towards the source of the force that impacted the blood. So like if I had a pool of blood and I hit it, some would go forward, some would come back towards me, so towards whatever object I hit it with. That would be the difference between forward spatter and back spatter. We'll talk about that a little bit more with gunshot spatter. So we talked about the shape and its patterns. Now let's talk about the size. The size can give me information about the velocity, how fast it was moving. If it falls vertically, the higher the height it's falling from, the faster it will be going when it hits the ground, and that's going to make it spread out more. So that means it's going to be a bigger drop. And you can kind of, but that's only if it's going directly vertical. If it is going somewhat sideways, then we see that the faster moving drops actually create smaller size spatter. So it's like, wait, did you just say the opposite thing? Yeah, I did. It's a little bit complicated. So in general, we would say that the faster moving it is makes a smaller drop. And you can kind of think about this like with rain. You know how like you get those big fat drops of rain, but it's not raining real hard. It's just at the beginning of a storm, and they make those big splashes on the ground. And then once the rain is coming down faster, it's much smaller. Of course, it's all on top of you, unless it was like a little shower or something. So we would see that if it's going very high speed, remember velocity is a more complicated word for speed. It implies more than just the speed, but let's say high speed spatter is going to have very small diameters of less than a millimeter. I don't want you to worry so much about the specific numbers, but I could say the smaller it is, the higher, the faster it's traveling. And very lower speed spatter is going to have more like 4 milliliters, which is like more than 1/4 of an inch, but less than 1/2 inch. And then these are in between. So we see that the size is going to tell us something about the speed.